Here's how to make that viral Ghibli AI effect.
Using just AI.
15 months of work versus 15 seconds with AI.
It's so easy, you could do it too.
It's time to talk about AI art.
It seems to be the one thing that makes us human.
You know, I hate to be that person, but what even is art? Is this art? Well, what about this? For most of human history, the concepts of art and artist, as we know them, did not exist. Some rich dude just threw money at you and you draw stuff for him to put in his living room. And whether your line of work was somehow different from, say, making pots alongside tens of other people at a workshop was not considered by, anyone. And why would it be? After all, it is the rich guy who was credited at the end because he most likely came up with the vibe and the idea, and you're nothing but a vessel that helps get the job done. And then, boom, Renaissance. And since the guys living in Italy had around 4 more centuries to kill before pizza margherita was invented, they decided that the next best thing was Renaissance humanism. AKA recognizing that we should maybe look into our humanity and learn how to read and study history and such. They also believed that art and creativity were different from just making pots, and that artists and art contributed a lot to society. Basically, if you want to really get into the mindset of a Renaissance humanist, just ask a straight man in his 30s if he's ever done LSD. Yeah, the beauty of the unique human experience. Could you stop? Yeah, the beauty of the unique human experience and the innate nature of creativity and empathy are so cool. Now, because tag bros did not exist in 15th century Italy, these notions were accepted by the rich dudes throwing money at the people who owned an easel and some brushes. And so the concepts of an artist and art, as we know them, came to be. They were still, of course, very much dismissive of what was made outside the West or in defiance, ignorance, or indifference to the idea of art, but baby steps. With this cultural movement and philosophy becoming widespread, the value of creativity started being recognized. Now, you might even get credit for that thing that you drew for the rich guy's living room, and now we all agree what art is. How cool is that? What? What do you mean we still don't? Fuck! In 1998, a certain diva named Jeff Blakely got so mad in an article published in the Landscape Architecture magazine, of all publications, that they wrote a whole essay in reply to it, and then printed said essay, and then sent it to the publication that decided that this level of haterade was worthy of a whole page in the October issue. Arguing used to be so cool, man, and now it's just bots trying to engagement bait on Twitter. The original piece by Stephanie Ross, entitled Gardens and the Death of Art, argued that gardening is no longer considered a fine art, since major artists do not make statements in this medium, and the sense of gardening's kinship to painting and poetry has been lost. Jeff, on the other hand, refused to accept this notion, stating the following in their reply: "Since Duchamp, anything can constitute art. In this intellectual climate, Boyce painted his face gold and carried a rabbit around a gallery, and it was art. Warhol filmed the Empire State Building for 8 hours straight. Damien Hirst cuts up cows and then floats them in transparent boxes of formaldehyde, and it is art." However overblown and silly this argument from the 90s might seem, it is nonetheless a great representation of the larger debate around what is and what isn't art that's been taking place since even before Marcel Duchamp signed that damned pissoir. Basically, in case you've never heard of the fountain, here's a rundown. Before bullying the French on TikTok was invented, us Europeans had to entertain ourselves by, going outside and doing stuff, mostly bullying the French in person. One particular Frenchman by the name of Marcel Duchamp decided to take out his French frustration on the Americans, the only acceptable target, as we all know. And he did that by entering into an exhibition organized by the Society of Independent Artists at the Grand Central Palace in New York. His contribution was a pissoir, flipped and signed R-Mut 1917. Despite the fact that the artist played by the rules and paid the exhibition fee, the piece was not displayed. I personally still think it's because Duchamp's French. However, that caused a commotion among both art and piss lovers, also known as the Dadaists. On the other side, the fountain was criticized for not being real art, as well as for being very vulgar and, a literal pissoir. What I'm getting at is that giving art an all-encompassing, exhaustive definition is extremely hard, if not completely impossible. But we'll nonetheless try to, because if you make a video essay and do not invoke or clumsily construct some sort of a definition, you'll be thrown into a snake pit full of Mr. Beast-esque YouTube shorts as punishment. Where do you think I spend my time in between videos?
I almost think that's so vague to me. I don't really know what it means. I don't know. It's one of those things that's so general that, and art itself is so general. Like I said, it can be anything.
The most well-known contemporary defense of The Fountain by Louise Norton goes as follows. I reply simply that the fountain was not made by a plumber, but by the force of an imagination. Norton also points out that, as for plumbing, that is absurd. The only works of art America has given are her plumbing and her bridges. It is not the object itself, then, but rather the artistic intent that is important. Duchamp's ready-made is valuable because an artist chose it, signed it, and brought it to the exhibition, and by doing those very actions, transformed its meaning. On their official website, Tate Gallery simply state that the ready-mades also asserted the principle that what is art is defined by the artist. This way of defining art, even if it was inspired by the French, seems to be the most rational to me. Art is something that is birthed by an artist out of vision and intention. Why do you make art?
I think everyone wants to be able to somehow convey what's in your imagination. And I think that's what all art is. I think you had a vision and you are trying to share it with other people. I don't know. It seems to be the one thing that makes us human.
Like any other self-respecting queer person, I love horror. Because if you stare at the void long enough, the void will eventually invite you to drag brunch. Whether in literature, film, or whatever else, it is often seen as one of the lower genres. I mean, sure, we did get almost a decade of classy, elevated A24-esque films that were not like the other trashy and ridiculous and sucky horror flicks. But in all honesty, I like the trashy and ridiculous and sucky ones. I might even like them more than the ones geared towards the elevated and fancy non-horror audiences. Now, I admit this here because I know this channel is a safe haven for people who like all things trashy, campy, and unserious, and recognize their intrinsic value in this godforsaken elitist world. But it's not like everyone just gathered around and decided all things bloody, gory, and unnecessarily Christian should be shamed just for the sake of it. Believe it or not, we do live in a society that constructs the categories of good and bad taste. One's taste in art has long been a signifier of belonging to a certain social group and a certain economic class. While we do like to think of taste as something innate, it is taught, observed, adjusted, and projected constantly. And historically, almost all forms of high art have been designated for those closer to the top of societal hierarchy.
Broke people should never laugh!
In 19th century Imperial Russia, ballet was reserved for the upper echelons of society and was thought of as an elevated form of art available to those who were educated, rich, and of a high-class heritage, not to the peasants and those dirty and broke losers who worked on land. If you were a girl from a good family and wanted to find a rich or even maybe a royalty-adjacent husband/lover, becoming a ballet dancer was a pretty solid way to almost definitely guarantee success. Naturally, after the October Revolution, Lenin and his cabinet were faced with a dilemma. What the fuck do we do about ballet? There were two camps advocating for either abolishing the big ballet companies as remnants of the imperial regime, or reframing ballet as art for the people and maintaining its influence on the global arena and strengthening USSR's soft power. The latter won, and soon factory workers flooded the theater auditoriums because the government distributed subsidized tickets. Down the line, that meant that for me, grown-up middle class in St. Petersburg came with a lot of ballet, theater, and opera visits, and those visits were not seen as a signifier of my belonging to some sophisticated and loaded societal strata. They just meant I was from St. Petersburg, and my mother knew a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy who'd get us discounts. While most modern-day societies do not have discrete class cultures like those in Imperial Russia or in 19th century Britain, certain patterns of cultural consumption become an instrument of class identification or means of advancing one's position within society's hierarchy. But it's obviously not only about the money. As the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu outlined in Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste, the notion of good taste has historically been a way that the crème de la crème separated themselves from us peasants. But, and there is a but, with various forms of art becoming more accessible thanks to the technological advancements of the last half a century or so, the situation kind of changed. I know you want my attention. I have to finish filming this though. I cannot just stop in the middle of it. Do you understand, baby? Do you understand me? I mean, now, if you wish to tame the seas, you can become a pirate and get your hands on virtually any piece of art, be it literature, movies, high-quality scans and pictures of paintings or sculptures, illegal recordings of musicals, you name it, some guy probably has a link for you. And, you know, the preferences of today's economical and political elites are definitely quite far from what would universally be considered good taste. By God, will someone please refer the White House cabinet to a tailor that knows what they're doing? And those same people are often the main proponents of AI art and imagery. I mean, we've all seen the Trump Pope picture, and Elon Musk and his fanboys could not stop generating fan art of that blob of a man as a hunk with a teeny tiny slutty little waist. At the same time, there's noticeable pushback against what we now know as classic AI image style with its questionable realism, high contrast, extra fingers, and, metal legs? A friend of mine, who is definitely not me, noticed a certain trend when working for an agency that specialized in social media UGC type ads. Whenever, definitely not me, was tasked with creating ads for companies that were using AI generated imagery or art in their product, the brief would have these huge red letters screaming at the reader from the very first page. Avoid the word AI or its iterations in the ad. And definitely not me, was working for the company in 2023. So the concept of AI-produced images was relatively fresh and not as annoying. We were still like a solid year out from AI slop taking over the internet. The majority of the people, as it was quickly figured out, thought of AI imagery as a fun novelty. Like, oh look, a computer can draw. But not as artistically valuable, high quality, or worthy of purchase.
I remember when it started getting a lot of buzz was probably 4 or 5 years ago. And I thought that was actually really interesting. People were already very mad about it, but it would create these weird sort of acid trip images. At that point, I actually liked it. I thought it was like this new interesting thing that everyone was sort of collaborating with. And then the more threatening it got, the more jobs it took. It sort of became more boring to me. It learned how to make a face, and people were like, oh, I'll make a photorealistic Disney princess. And it just did it. And it was sort of, it didn't feel like art anymore. It felt like it was just, I don't know, a printer. It seems like the cool thing to be opposed to AI art. So, and I'm totally for that.
And there's actual evidence backing this up. An anthropocentric bias is something that researchers have identified in the way we evaluate art. But why?
Novels of two kinds. Good ones and bestsellers.
In his 1987 novel Misery, Stephen King describes the protagonist Paul Sheldon as a writer
who wrote novels of two kinds. Good ones and bestsellers.
Misery is probably my favorite thing King has ever written. If you're not familiar with the plot, it's basically just two people in a room. There's Paul Sheldon, the author who gets into an accident on his way to New York after finishing a novel he considers serious and award-worthy and is proud of, and Annie Wilkes, self-proclaimed #1 fan of Paul's more popular historical romance, who rescues him and then becomes his captor, forcing him to be her pet writer and physically and psychologically abusing him. In his memoir entitled On Writing, King confesses that his addiction to various substances, coke and alcohol among them, manifested in his fiction being a scream for help. In particular, when talking about the novel in question, the author says, Annie was coke, Annie was booze, and I decided I was tired of being Annie's pet writer. While Stephen King himself has had run-ins with certain #1 fans, and parallels can be drawn between him and Paul, the protagonist, he claims that the theme of authors' integrity and relationship with their fans, as well as art itself, was not intended as central to the piece. But in his own words,
fiction is a lie, but good fiction is the truth inside the lie.
To Paul, Annie, his captor, is a representation of bad taste. Throughout the book, he makes snide remarks about her graceless furniture, frumpy house skirts, and most importantly, her love for his book series about Misery Chastain, which he considers to be beneath him as an artist. But, you know, those novels do pay the bills. Paul refers to Annie as the constant reader, implying that she doesn't examine the works critically enough. Similarly, he also looks down on her and her love for popular fiction, which he refers to as degenerate. I should note, he refers to it as degenerate like semi-ironically. However, that very much applies to the way that he views his own Misery series. It's a long conversation. Just trust me. Just trust me. And this is the first aspect I deem important to our modern day evaluations of good and bad art, and by proxy, good and bad taste. In absence of rigid class cultures, you gotta find a way to make sense of different types of art, and a way of making yourself feel superior to others.
Miss, I'm so sorry. What does it feel like to be an elitist New York piece of shit?
It feels awesome.
With the overall broader availability of art and its often almost instant mass distribution, we invented the new art versus craft. Babe, wake up. Art versus entertainment just dropped. And yes, it's still very Western-centric and very arbitrary, even though some concerns surrounding the industrialization of art are very valid. Entertainment, deemed shallow and profit-oriented, is almost always equated to pop culture, mass production and distribution, and similarly, is seen as being of lower quality and higher availability. Think of the way the general audience perceives Marvel movies, Adam Sandler comedies, and please don't come for me, lovers of eco-terrorism, Taylor Swift. Basically, in the words of a certain magazine editor, the principle that we see guiding all things mass and popular is as follows. KISS. Keep it simple for the stupids. To Paul Sheldon, his Misery book series is nothing but pulp fiction, and its huge sales and circulation serve to prove it. The quote I used at the beginning of this chapter establishes that to the protagonist, good and best-selling are categories with little to no intersection. This is a pattern of thinking repeated multiple times throughout the novel. When Paul is forced to burn the manuscript of Fast Cars, the book he actually considers good, his inner monologue refers to it as
a book that will sell half as many copies as the least successful Misery book.
AI art, similarly to Paul's Misery books, is seen as bubblegum for the masses. It's unsophisticated, it's available, it's unoriginal. Why would you consider valuable something you can generate a newer version of, a version better suited to your unique taste, in minutes, with minimum effort and investment? This is the main reason, as definitely not me, and colleagues theorized, of why involvement of AI was to be kept as far away from the ads as possible. But there's another reason that, in my opinion, impacts our perception of what is worthy of being called good and what isn't even more. Something philosopher C.T. Nguyen calls aesthetic sincerity. In Trust and Sincerity in Art, Nguyen points to the social and emotional aspects of our relationship with art and artists and proposes a framework that includes 3 forms of trust we can place in artists or the product of their creative process: trust in aesthetic competence, trust in aesthetic sincerity, and trust in aesthetic steadfastness. He calls the trust in aesthetic sincerity the most important to ensuring both good and original art will be created and rewarded. The paper defines it as trust that somebody will act aided by aesthetic considerations. Basically, trust that someone makes the art that they make because they think it's good and it's the art they want to be making. As the philosopher points out at the very beginning, we feel most thoroughly betrayed by an artist not when they make bad art, but when they sell out. Bo Burnham tackles the same topic in 2016's Make Happy when he parodies corny artists making country music for the sole purpose of getting money out of it, not because the genre is close to them in any way.
I think some of the greatest songwriters of all time are country artists, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, you know? And if you're writing honestly, that is art. Problem is, with a lot of modern country music, the sort of Keith Urban brand of country music, is that it is not honest. It is the exact opposite.
A lot of the song is focused on sincerity in the more traditional sense, of course, but the lack of aesthetic sincerity does shine through.
Thematically meandering, emphatically pandering. I got a tight grip on my demo's balls. Say the word truck, they jizz in their overalls.
Paul Sheldon does not see his Misery books as a testament to his artistry. In fact, he has hated Misery as if she were a real person ever since the 3rd book. To him, writing another Misery novel is equivalent to stepping on his own neck. Listen to this extract from the book, for example.
When you pervert the talent God gave you by calling it a business, I hate that. I'm sorry, you ought to be, she said stonily. You might as well call yourself a whore. No, Annie, he thought, suddenly filled with fury. I am no whore. Fast Cars was about not being a whore. That's what Killing That Goddamn Bitch Misery was about, now that I think about it.
To Paul, the misery novels are antithetic to aesthetic sincerity, and therefore infinitely less valuable than any of his serious work. They're a money printing machine, maybe deserving of the audience's trust in Paul's aesthetic steadfastness and competence, but not his aesthetic sincerity.
It didn't jibe with his self-image as a serious writer who was only churning out these shitty romances in order to subsidize his, flourish of trumpets please, real work.
And while artists that we believe to be committed to aesthetic sincerity can, of course, take commissions or make money off their art in any other way, it is only as long as the audience is sure this whole money-making thing does not compromise the sincerity in question. On a basic human level, we value art that we believe comes from the heart. Like here, you can often catch a similar definition of an artist out in the wild.
PJ is someone I would consider a real artist. He puts his heart and soul into his work, and he creates simply for the love of creating.
And fucking obviously, this is not me shaming anyone for making money off their art. I'm recapping the theory, okay? I know a lot of people cannot fucking listen. AI art, then, is perceived worse than any of the misery novels because there's nothing aesthetically sincere about it. In the case of ChatGPT's Ghibli copycat images, this aspect is highlighted. As Kyle Chayka writes for The New Yorker, if asked to come up with a quintessentially human work of art, one could do worse than to name a film by Studio Ghibli. The replication of Studio Ghibli's style has no meaning without the collective feeling we have for the Miyazaki aesthetic, inspired by its films. In our present moment, I worry much less for artists who are driven to create things than for audiences who may be content to settle for so many pale imitations. And here's also where the third reason comes in. The slop generated by AI is quite different from, say, your run-of-the-mill pop girlies reverse engineering their music based on market research and aiming to make as much money as possible. While both are examples of aesthetic and sincerity, the music put out by the sellout pop girly was created by a human being whom we can trust or distrust, whether her or her writers or her team or whatever. In the case of AI, there's just nothing. When discussing enshittification, the gradual decline of quality of services in pursuit of profit first and foremost, Matthew Gault asks, what are LLMs like ChatGPT if not the final attempt of the Valley to devour and regurgitate the user-generated internet back into our mouths? James Baldwin, in his infamous speech on artists' struggle for integrity, says only poets, aka artists, know the truth about us. He also says the following about the power that art holds.
When I was very young, and I'm sure this is true for everybody here, I assumed that no one had ever been born who was only 5 foot 6 inches tall, or been born poor, or been born ugly, or masturbated. No one had ever suffered the way I suffered. And then you discover, and I discovered this through Dostoevsky, that it is common. Everybody did it. Not only did everybody do it, everybody's doing it. And all the time. It's a fantastic and terrifying liberation.
In Misery, King explores the question of artistic integrity through Paul's crisis of his previously stark opinions regarding what writing of his is worthy, and whether he really does hate his pulp fiction heroine.
Yet a deeper part of him suspected that to think that way was kidding himself. Not kidding yourself, Paul. Tell the goddamn truth. Lying to yourself. Once you start that shit, you might as well just cover up your typewriter and start studying for a broker's license or something, because you're down the toilet.
In his memoir, Stephen King remarks that Paul's efforts to play Scheherazade and save his life gave him a chance to say some things about the redemptive power of writing that he had long felt but never articulated, a sentiment that echoes Baldwin's approach. Similarly, the inner monologue of his protagonist emphasizes the space suffering occupies in the artistic process.
Because writers remember everything, Paul, especially the hurts. Strip a writer to the buff, point to the scars, and he'll tell you the story of each small one. From the big ones, you get novels, not amnesia. A little talent is a nice thing to have if you want to be a writer, but the only real requirement is that ability to remember the story of every scar.
The beauty of art lies within understanding that your suffering is not unique. It unites us across generations, countries, cultures, languages, and whatever other distinctions you can come up with. You can even relate to the French. No matter how shallow and aesthetically insincere your favorite love song is, it's still your favorite love song for a reason. In fact, our bias against AI-generated art pushes us to appreciate human-made art more. As Horton and colleagues point out in their study, comparing images labeled as human-made to images labeled as AI-made increases perception of human creativity, an effect that can be leveraged to increase the value of human effort. This is also why we feel the outrage we do when Spotify is facilitating the existence and popularity of AI musicians.
Another glaring issue is that these artists are getting hundreds of thousands of monthly listeners and millions of plays on their songs.
In my experiment, I exhaustively scraped 560 of Suno's top generated songs and staff picks, and out of those 560, only 11 were not being monetized by posing as a human artist on a digital streaming platform.
Even without getting into the ethics of AI, which we will do later, the lack of a human behind the art almost feels offensive. In the case of human-made art, no matter how raw and unrefined the sound is, no matter how far away from the key the vocalist strays, it's a reflection of a real human experience.
When the chow is tea but the finnet is gag, sis, I'm dead as a child. Girl. Real.
The innate humanity of art is something AI cannot reproduce, for it doesn't know what a human existence is. In the now infamous clip, Hayao Miyazaki called AI an insult to life itself for this exact reason.
毎朝この頃会わないけど身体障害の友人がいるんですよ。そのハイタッチするんだけど大変なんです。彼の筋肉がこわばってる手と僕の手でこうハイタッチする。でその彼のことを思い出してね、僕はこれ面白いと思って見ることできないんですよ。これを作る人たちは痛みとかそういうものについてね、何も考えないでやってるでしょ。極めて不愉快ですよね。極めて何か生命に対する侮辱を感じます。
Finally, our trust in aesthetic sincerity in art spills over to those who are in charge of what art we are exposed to. To quote Nguyen yet again, museum goers trust curators to choose aesthetically profound works and not just aim to maximize ticket sales. Actors trust their directors, classical musicians trust their conductors, painters trust manufacturers to be meticulous in making pigments on paper. Readers trust critics to get at the heart of an artwork instead of just saying clever stuff to advance their careers. In the age of algorithmic recommendations that often influence our perception and consumption of art, the new, complicated, and unexplored is not as likely to be put in front of you as something that the algorithm deems attention-grabbing enough for you to stay on the website long enough to watch some more ads. To quote Kao Cheika yet again, but this time his book Filter World, attention becomes the only metric by which culture is judged. And what gets attention is dictated by equations developed by Silicon Valley engineers. The outcome of such algorithmic gatekeeping is the pervasive flattening that has been happening across culture. By flatness, I mean homogenization, but also a reduction into simplicity. The least ambiguous, least disruptive, and perhaps least meaningful pieces of culture are promoted the most. Flatness is the lowest common denominator, an averageness that has never been the marker of humanity's proudest cultural creations. The AI art you see most often is exactly what algorithms often favor. It's an average of the images that got good feedback from the developers and users.
Vision is what an artist has, and it doesn't seem to have a vision. It's just averaging things, and it can make very photorealistic averages of things, but it doesn't seem to be creating anything.
This computer circle jerk only serves to further increase the visibility of AI-generated imagery and highlight our lack of trust in the current beep beep boop boop gatekeepers and tastemakers. Or, if there's still any trust left, diminish it. And while stories of success found by artists through their use of social media do exist, it is often in spite of the current day algorithmic landscape than because of it. As Jason Kopler, the co-founder of 404 Media, writes in regards to Meta's plan to continue promoting AI within its algorithms, what Zuckerberg is describing, of course, are social media networks that are not even remotely social, and which may increasingly not even feature much human-made content at all. Both Facebook and Instagram are already going this way, with the rise of AI spam, AI influencers, and armies of people copy-pasting and clipping content from other social media networks to build their accounts. This content and this system, Meta said, has led to an 8% increase in time spent on Facebook and a 6% increase in time spent on Instagram, all at the expense of a shared reality and human connections to other humans. The very principles of social media algorithms that rule our media consumption go against everything that, as C.T. Nguyen claims, makes the production and appreciation of good art possible. So sure, if there's real observable bias against AI art among the general population, as well as quite clear reasons as to why this bias exists, why is AI-generated slop everywhere then? Why is Shrimp Jesus taking over my granny's Facebook feed?
Why are they there then?
My granny does not have Facebook, she's Russian. But I'm sure her Vkontakte feed is also full of Shrimp Jesus and other fucking slop.
Who
is
afraid of real
human
art?
When Nazis came to power in 1933, they swiftly got to fighting what they claimed to be degenerate art. The so-called chambers of horrors and exhibitions of shame, which were being organized around the country, aimed to publicly point at the modern artist the state deemed undesirable and sick, and shame them out of existence, with the most well-known exhibition taking place in Munich in 1937. That same year, Große Deutsche Kunstausstellung, aka the Great German Art Exhibition, was organized in order to establish what good and ideologically correct art looked like. The official Holocaust Encyclopedia of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum points out the reason for this in their summary of the events. The Nazis also claimed that the ambiguity of modern art contained Jewish and communist influences that could quote-unquote, endanger public security and order. They claimed that modern art conspired to weaken German society with quote-unquote cultural Bolshevism. While the rise of anti-intellectual narratives and attitudes, as well as the decades-long devaluing of humanities studies and research may incline you to say, it's not that deep, bro. It really often is that deep. The positioning of then modern and now contemporary art as degenerate, regressive, and indicative of some sort of societal decay has been a rhetoric utilized by literal Nazis in order to facilitate squeezing whole demographics of people out of the ability to express themselves artistically and out of literal life. Reject modernity, embrace tradition is not just a mimetic sentence from a while ago. It's also a way for the far right to recognize each other and, in cases of communication with the outside world, get their ideology's foot in the door. Think of all those art lover accounts on Twitter that specialize in glazing antiquity and putting down the art they don't, or even worse, straight up refuse to understand. The Ewan hunk with the slutty little waist is often posed as a Roman emperor or surrounded by marble and gold, and not as, say, a character in a John Waters movie for a reason. And that reason is the communication of ideology. Obviously, I'm not implying that anyone who doesn't like Comedian by Maurizio Catalan is a right-winger. We all have our preferences, and if meta art that plays on phallic symbols isn't your thing, that's not indicative of anything nefarious. What is indicative of extremist right-wing ideologies, however, is the narrative that specific types of art, most often modern and contemporary, as I've said, is a signifier of societal decay and decadence that, no doubt, is going to be followed by a collapse. And as Felix Schlick from the University of Tübingen puts it, rise and fall, blossom and decay, apocalypse and palingenesis, meaning a national or ethnic rebirth. In an article outlining Musk's use of the decadence narrative, Schlick also notes that he found the same pattern in his research analyzing German and French neo-fascist magazines, something he dubbed the conservative crisis narratives. The ongoing assault on cultural institutions, as well as education deemed too woke by the current US administration, follows this exact type of thinking. From Doge's visit to the National Gallery, which relies heavily on state support, to Donald Trump brute forcing his way into being in control of the Kennedy Center, claiming that its chairmen do not share his vision for a golden age in arts and culture. While not mentioned directly in Trump's original post, drag shows are implied to be the breaking point, and the moral panic surrounding drag as an art form, and any gender transgressions, let's be honest, is yet again indicative of conservative crisis narratives. Later, Trump literally spelled it out for everyone, saying he was going to eliminate drag shows and quote-unquote other anti-American propaganda from the center's programming.
Why do you want to be chairman of the Kennedy Center board?
Because I want to make sure it runs properly. We don't need woke at the Kennedy Center.
It is quite obvious that these actions and statements are not just about art. The restrictions imposed on drag performers and the promised eradication of woke at Kennedy Center, similarly to the exhibitions of degenerate art, showcase whose existence in society is considered undesirable and threatening. The use of the narrative of wokeness and the woke mind virus being the downfall of the US is in no way accidental and does not stem from personal tastes only, but those same personal tastes did, and continue to, influence the aesthetics of AI. And while I do love discussing the more theoretical side of AI art and our relationship with it, as I did in the previous chapter, we do have to confront the fact that a big reason for anti-AI sentiments is the ideological affiliation that seeps through every AI image, no matter how innocuous. If not instructed to apply a certain artist's style, AI generates art that, looks like this. And part of the reason it does is quite simple: the preferences of the increasingly more right-leaning tech sphere.
And that is a prediction by an AI of which images are most attractive to people. But people in that case are the people who produce the training data for that kind of predictive AI, people who already rated images online, and they could show, these people in these ratings, that's a very small demographic of mostly white, young, male, North American, middle class, very online guys. And their aesthetic expectations are baked into these models as a kind of standard aesthetic of what makes not only a cat image then, but a beautiful cat image.
The same reason is mentioned by Caroline Nims-Nice of The Atlantic in their Why Does AI Art Look Like That piece. In particular, Nice, informed by the expertise of the industry's leading professionals, cites reinforcement learning from human feedback and the influence of human evaluators. It should be said that this is the type of aesthetic preference cultivated not only by ideology, but also, as I would argue, by a lack of education when it comes to art and a general lack of aesthetic competency.
Like in any profession, as you become more of a professional in that, you develop taste. Someone who is making large language models likely doesn't have artistic taste. Just like I would look at some line of code and be like, wow, you must be so smart. And it could be written by an idiot who's in a 101 class. I don't know the difference. But the guys who made the computer program are the ones on the news telling you that this is the best art imaginable and blah, blah, blah.
The people who were and are largely in charge of what AI imagery was going to look like and where it goes from here have no understanding of what makes art appealing or good beyond the simple reject modernity, embrace tradition. Trump's second term has been dubbed the AI slob presidency by Matthew Gold, who brings to the forefront a very important aspect of the extremist right's love for AI. Namely, the fact that AI helps visualize, validate, and legitimize their worldview and rhetoric. Gold writes, AI allows Trump's team to create media that would never exist otherwise, a particularly useful tool for a president and administration that has a hostile relationship with reality. The use of AI art and AI imagery as a way that extremists across various countries try to visualize their perceived reality was noted by The Guardian's Ben Quinn and Dan Milmo, who point out that AI is often deployed to incite or intensify the fear of immigrant others. This, combined with media's general underrepresentation of migrants, except for when they are framed as some sort of threat, makes for one fucking powerful beast. While I was working on the script, Grok, Musk's pet AI chatbot, seemingly lost its mind and for a few hours could not help but bring up the conspiracy of South African white genocide in response to any query. The official statement regarding the incident by XAI claims that an unauthorized modification was made to the Grok response bot's prompt. And while it's not naming the persons responsible, certain theories have, of course, started circulating. Against the backdrop of Musk's obsession with South Africa's racial politics and Trump cutting aid to the country and welcoming a handful of white South Africans as refugees, Grok's short-lived obsession certainly looks suspicious. But perhaps the most obvious example of weaponizing AI in this way is the case of Algerian Olympic boxer Imam Khalif, who was accused of being trans by our usual suspects and, as a result, subjected to an international hate campaign, all because she was deemed not feminine enough, which I should say racism played a big part in. The narrative of an unfair biological advantage that Khalif supposedly had was legitimized via AI-generated images, such as this one, which features her head in a masculine body, and this one, in which Khalif was not merely represented as a man towering over a dainty, vulnerable white woman, but was denied humanity altogether and drawn as a supernatural, mythical beast. In reality, of course, no such stark difference in the athlete's statures or muscle mass existed. That's just how boxing works, which is common knowledge, I fear. Khalif and her Italian opponent Carini are both muscular women of similar height, but you can't exactly sell that story to a crowd of gender criticals that are out for blood, which is where AI-generated alternative reality comes in. And on the rare occasion that right-wing extremist art is created by humans, it still serves the exact same purpose.
We've got the big, scary, blue-haired trans liberals who don't actually exist, so you have to draw them so that you can make them seem real.
But there's a second aspect to this creation of AI-generated reality. It is also being used to alter the imagery associated with extremist right-wing actors. Yes, we're back to Musk's imagined slutty little teeny tiny waist. Just like in the case of Khalif, the reality of Musk's body does not match the image he wants to project. Cracking jokes about the way Bill Gates looks is only fun as long as you pretend your physique is somehow better. But tricking yourself into thinking you have a full head of fluffy hair that the sun beautifully illuminates must not be good for your mental health. To put it simply, in the words of a classic, you can never be that pretty or iconic. Similarly, AI fan art of Trump that his official account cannot stop posting alters his appearance significantly, helping once again shape the image of him as younger, stronger, leaner, and more cognitively capable than he is in real life. The MAGA movement's artistic aesthetic is AI slop, and Donald Trump is its king. Another reason for AI art's popularity within certain circles is quite simple. It's the fact that you do not need an artist in order to achieve the desired result. As Gareth Watkins, who calls AI the new aesthetics of fascism, writes, "The selling point of LLMs is that their users don't have to pay, and more importantly, interact with, a person who is felt to be beneath them, but upon whose technical skills they'd be forced to depend." The right-wing extremists regularly position themselves as anti-humanities, with all their talk about woke gender studies, which goes hand in hand with being anti-artist, but not necessarily anti-art. The problem lies within the largely liberal and leftist leanings of the art scene, as well as within the necessity to undergo a lengthy process of negotiation and collaboration when commissioning an art piece by a real person. To quote Goat again, that doesn't happen with AI-generated images. There is no creation process. There's only instant gratification. Whatever impulsive and grotesque thought pops into the mind of the creator can immediately be realized. What further contributes to this is, of course, the AI-loving crowd's relationship with labor. How did you find out that you were one of the artists ripped off for Midjourney?
I honestly don't recall. Someone must have told me. And I was honestly flattered, you know. I remember I felt sort of like this was inevitable, and I don't know how to fight a $400 billion company like OpenAI over something like this. Because they had been claiming up until that point that no one was using copyrighted work. And everyone in the back of our minds was like, I don't really see how that's possible. I didn't feel like I was now on the warpath against AI. I just sort of felt like this was an inevitability. as sad as that sounds.
Listen, I rarely bring up Marx on the first date, but, I really feel a spark between us, babe. Between 1998 and 1999, a discussion between John Molyneux and Chris Neynham took place. Basically, the girls were fighting by addressing each other's takes on the pages of International Socialism, and at the center of this discussion was art and alienation of labor. Alienated labor, also known as estranged labor, is a concept originally coined by Marx, and it has multiple characteristics, but the ones most relevant to the discussion are A, the fact that the work is external to the worker, i.e., it does not belong to his intrinsic nature, that in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself but denies himself, and B, that such labor is not the satisfaction of a need, it is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. During this surprisingly civil exchange of public responses, Molyneux claimed art is non-alienated labor, while Neynham asserted that alienation of labor under capitalism does apply to art. While both make valid points, I'm inclined to agree with Molyneux, who states, commodification of the product does not equal commodification of the labor that produces the product, nor does it equal the alienation of that labor. In King's Misery,
you thought it was over.
In King's Misery, Paul's status as Annie Wilkes' prisoner and pet writer can be seen as the extreme version of the conditions contributing to the alienation of labor. The literal tagline of the book is, Paul Sheldon used to write for a living, now he's writing to stay alive. What is Paul's forced writing of another misery novel if not a means to satisfy needs external to that labor? aka staying alive. And initially, the second condition seems to be fulfilled. The act not being intrinsic to Paul's nature, as well as him denying himself as an artist by writing for Annie. However, and there is a however, the redemptive power of the artistic process, in this case, writing, discussed by King, shines through, no matter the circumstances. When Paul wastes multiple opportunities to try and escape, he examines his motivation and comes to the conclusion that
at first it was his broken legs and crushed pelvis. Then, God help him, the book had taken off. In a crazy way, he was even having fun with it. It would be easy, too easy, to blame everything on his broken bones or the dope, when in fact so much of it had been the book.
And also,
it wasn't Annie that was holding him back. It was the manuscript.
Despite the fact that the new misery novel was initially created to satisfy his captor's wishes,
he did not look through that hole in the paper to see Annie or please Annie. He looked through it to get away from Annie.
No matter the conditions and circumstances, King positions writing as non-alienated labor. An artist cannot help but create art. It is intrinsic to their nature. Even when forced to abide Wilkes, Paul Sheldon continues to create, which results in something he couldn't have expected.
The irony was that the woman had coerced him into writing what was easily the best of the misery novels.
Even though Misery's return has to be tailored towards Annie's tastes and desires, it maintains the author's input and his artistic voice, something AI simply does not have. As Watkins points out, to the extreme right crowd, the absence of humans is a feature, not a bug, of AI art. The ability to ultimately pose as the creator of a piece of art while not having invested time into mastering the skills needed or asking for someone else to provide the service, as well as possessing full editorial authority, is an ego-stroking experience for those using AI to generate what they deem to be art. These attitudes, albeit in their latent and non-extremist form, can be observed in the now infamous "art just became accessible" tweet. Art has always been accessible, dipshit. It came free with your fucking consciousness and the ability to steal paper and pencils from IKEA. What just became accessible was the ability to feel like an accomplished artist without having to go through any of the motions to make yourself into one. And the claims that the statement was referring to people with disabilities is frankly just insulting. Artists with physical and/or mental disabilities have been present since the beginning of time, and claiming that they are incapable of bringing their art to life without AI just implies you don't see them as capable of creating worthy art on their own, which is patronizing bullshit. But back to business. Describing the artistic process and its results, King uses language that equates the artist to a deity. When Annie forces Paul to burn his latest manuscript, the smell of burning paper is referred to as the smell of uncreation. And within the new misery novel itself, one of the characters asks himself whether God could really be cruel enough to let misery die. Finally, Annie herself outright states that a writer is a god to the people in a story. While this is obviously an exaggerated description of the feelings the artistic process invokes and the way we perceive artists, there is a grain of truth to it. The instant gratification that generating AI art provides, then, serves one's ego in more ways than one. It helps the user feel powerful, like a deity of sorts, by way of playing into an illusion of being a capital C creator, an illusion of gaming the system of artistic creation, without becoming one of those pesky artists that want credit for their work because they put in time and effort and whatever. And finally, there is a simpler answer as to why the AI slop seems to be taking over the internet. It's profit. The people in charge of our social media feeds are banking on AI being the next big thing. Whether they truly believe in it, honestly, is irrelevant. Zuckerberg, who somehow started dressing even worse after his fresh divorcee-style rebrand, continues pushing AI content on Facebook and Instagram because it's profitable, and it helps keep users engaged with the website longer. Back in October of 2024, he pitched a whole new category of content, which is AI-generated or AI-summarized content, or kind of existing content put together by AI in some way, and then rolled out AI profiles at the beginning of 2025, despite the fact that a similar initiative failed spectacularly in 2023. At this point, we've all seen the interview where Zuck claims that it's easy to make good products. You just have to listen to your audiences. And the audiences have shown time after time that they can't get it up for AI. So why does the Meta CEO continue to push it down everyone's throats? It's strictly business. Max Reed, after observing and interviewing so-called sloptrepreneurs, has found that to Meta, AI images are not just junk. On the contrary, they are precisely what the company wants, highly engaging content. Jason Kobler of 404 Media came to the same conclusion when investigating the origins of AI slop. He calls it the evolution of a Facebook spam economy. In another article, Kobler argues against the popular dead internet theory, writing, "The platform has become something worse than bots talking to bots. It is bots talking to bots, bots talking to bots at the direction of humans, humans talking to humans, humans talking to bots, humans arguing about a fake thing made by a bot, humans talking to no one without knowing it, hijacked human accounts being turned into bots, humans worried that the other humans they're talking to are bots, hybrid human/bot accounts, the end of a shared reality, and at the center of all of this, one of the most valuable companies on the planet enabling the shit show because its human executives and shareholders have too much money riding on the mass adoption of reality-breaking technology to do anything about it." Elon Musk has his own toxic X-type history with OpenAI, which he later tried and failed to buy, and that led to Grok and its South Africa ramblings. AI art and AI-generated content in general is great from a business standpoint. You don't have to split the revenue with the artists or creators if you just scrape their work and use it to train the model that you don't have to pay, work with, or see as equal.
I'm more of like an illustrator, or I do keyframes, where just like you do a whole scene with lots of characters. But a lot of my friends were concept artists. I do know a lot of concept artists in the movie industry that lost their jobs and are having a difficult time because AI is so good at iterating on ideas rapidly.
Just source some cheap or literally prison labor, crack open a cold one, and look at the money rolling in. It's virtually impossible to avoid talking to a chatbot when interacting with companies nowadays. And AI has been involved in a plethora of scandals, from its use in the creation of non-consensual pornography to AI chatbots engaging in explicit sexual conversations with minors, to alleged responsibility for a teenager taking his own life, to automated denial of healthcare, to encouraging delusions and self-harm. Sustainability goals declared by tech companies also went out the window with the advent and popularization of AI.
Even though Google is paying to build more solar and wind farms than ever, it can't keep up with all the new data center capacity it is building to power its AI ambitions.
It's been shown time after time that most, if not all, AI models are still an unreliable, half-baked technology. But nothing matters as long as the line on the quarterly profits graph goes up. So, where do we go from here? As part of getting my master's degree, I was recently attending a course that focused on research methodology. It was a regular session and everyone in class was presenting their work with archives and literature review so far. That was honestly all pretty boring until I heard a little something that sent me into a spiral. When explaining the workflow, a classmate of mine said, I asked ChatGPT what criteria I should use, and it said, now, this is not a comment on the academic capabilities or personal character of the person in question. In fact, the few times that we've spoken, they've been nothing but nice, and I truly have no reason to doubt whether they're qualified enough. After all, we are in the same program. What was shocking to me was how normalized over-reliance on AI had become. In a course that was all about working with data and previous academic findings, the admission to not doing your work and instead relying on an LLM was not met with disapproval, or at least not open disapproval. While the scholarship surrounding AI and the effects its constant use can have on critical thinking is still very underdeveloped, with results inconclusive, we do know that AI is not a reliable source. LLMs are prone to hallucinations and simply do not possess the same critical thinking skills as qualified specialists. Yet, at Grok, is this accurate? And I asked ChatGPT, are becoming more and more common, and I can't help but think of the people glued to their everything chairs in WALL-E. I also cannot help but think of the poem entitled For a Student Who Used AI to Write a Paper by Joseph Fasano, which ends like this. But what are you trying to be free of? The living? The miraculous task of it? Love is for the ones who love the work. It's easy to point fingers and call people lazy and stupid, and I think we should be actively calling out the unnecessary use of AI in academia, art, and any other field for that matter. But the people in WALL-E didn't just abandon Earth on their own. It was the mega corporation by and large that both facilitated the ecocide and created the fucking hover chairs. People in WALL-E are capable of change and willing to put in the work. They are empathetic, loving, and determined. And there's no reason to believe that we are somehow any different. The anti-intellectualism we face today isn't solely the product of right-wing propaganda. It also has its roots in disenfranchisement a lot of people feel, which is fueled by the elitism of higher education and academia and their unavailability to a huge portion of the planet's population. If I wasn't born in a post-Soviet country, but instead, say, in the US, I would very likely not have been able to pursue higher education or would have to take on life-crushing debt to do so. And that's yet another thing I cannot stop thinking about. The other me wouldn't have been less deserving, because everyone is deserving of education, but they still would not have had the ability to have their interests met. And scholarships for gifted kids are not a solution, for they are part of the same exclusionary system. And The Truth is Paywalled, but the Lies Are Free, Nathan Robinson points out that a white supremacist on YouTube will tell you all about race and IQ, but if you want to read a careful scholarly refutation, obtaining a legal PDF from the journal publisher would cost you $14.95, a price nobody in their right mind would pay for one article if they can get institutional access. Now it's more important than ever to try and make information and the ways of critically examining it and working with it available to everyone. And more important than ever to try and support artists across the globe in their ongoing struggles against the slop industrial complex. There's EGARE, the European Guild for Artificial Intelligence Regulation, Misteri del Fumetto in Italy, Artes Etica in Latin America, as well as the Authors Guild and the Concept Art Association in the US, as well as other initiatives aiming to protect artists. I'm sure there are more organizations like this, and if you know of them, please share them in the comments. I'm gonna try and incorporate them into a Google Doc that's gonna be linked in the pinned comment and the description of the video. Doomerism is easy to fall into, but it doesn't exactly help anyone. And we've seen that the masses do not long for AI-generated slop. As Soraya Roberts rightfully notes, AI art only looks like art if you don't care. And the majority of people do care. Cultivating environments that are critical towards and unaccepting of AI art is something we can do, and something we have done before. Look, for instance, at the reception of AI-generated art used in Late Night with the Devil. Advocating for real artists is crucial in these truly dire fucking times, and I refuse to let a bunch of badly dressed, boding cunts who don't even bother to pretend to have humanity's best interest in mind define what art is. In Nothing Personal, which was first published in 1964, James Baldwin proclaimed that people in the US have a very curious sense of reality, or rather, perhaps I should say, a striking addiction to irreality. 60 years later, this still stands true and applies to those outside the US too. It seems to have crossed both space and time. Baldwin also wrote, "Where the people can sing, the poet can live." And it is worth saying it the other way around too. Where the poet can sing, the people can live. When a civilization treats its poets with the disdain with which we treat ours, it cannot be far from disaster. But art does not cease to exist, and our connection to it and appreciation of it is infinitely more powerful and life-saving than jerking on that doomer knob. For nothing is fixed, forever and forever and forever. It is not fixed. The earth is always shifting, the light is always changing, the sea does not cease to grind down rock. Lovers cling to each other and children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out. At the end of Misery, Paul Sheldon, even after losing physical parts of himself and struggling with intense PTSD, continues to think about writing, because it's in his nature.
Paul didn't know if it was true and didn't really care anymore. He only wanted to get it behind him and find the next book.
And the only prospect that's truly scary to him is that he's not going to be able to write anymore.
But as dry days became dry weeks, became dry months, he had begun to wonder if there ever would be a next book.
The struggle to express and create in spite of anything is part of human nature, and no amount of AI slop will ever be able to change that. Even on the used, abused, and abandoned Earth, WALL-E makes portraits of Eve and falls asleep to a love song.